Welcome to this explainer on the Middle and Southern Colonies. Today, we're going to unpack how the landscape itself actually forged entirely different societies along the Atlantic coast. It's like a giant puzzle where geography dictates everything, setting up a clash of cultures that would ultimately define American history.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll map out the colonies. Second, we'll dive into the geography and ports. Third, we'll look at populations and labor systems. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a quick recap. Let's get right into it. All right, Section 1, Mapping the English Colonies, specifically looking at expansion and the Restoration.
If we look at the timeline, the early 1600s were, frankly, a massive struggle. You've got Jamestown barely surviving in 1607 and Maryland popping up in the 1630s. But then, fast forward to the 1660s and boom, expansion absolutely explodes. Why? Well, King Charles II needed to pay off some serious political debts, so he basically handed out massive tracts of American land like a royal giveaway. That's how we get New York, New Jersey, and the Carolinas. And then in 1681, he grants William Penn this huge proprietary colony, Pennsylvania, just to settle a debt he owed to Penn's dad.
Moving right along to Section 2, Geography, Crops, and Ports. This is where we start building our regional comparison.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast between the regions. On one hand, you have the southern colonies. These were your cash crop powerhouses. We're talking warm climates, deep river systems, just absolutely perfect for massive plantations growing tobacco, rice, and indigo. But then, look at the middle colonies. They had a much more temperate climate and super rich wooded land. Because of their central location, they basically became the breadbasket of the colonies, focusing heavily on grain and livestock, and they built these rapidly growing trade hubs like Philadelphia and New York.
Let's drill down into the South for a second. You see a massive reliance on highly profitable, incredibly labor-intensive crops. Virginia and Maryland, they were completely consumed by tobacco. Further south, South Carolina is building immense wealth on rice and indigo, which, by the way, produced this dark blue dye that English royalty absolutely loved. Up in North Carolina, they're tapping into their pine forests for tar, pitch, and turpentine. These were known as naval stores, and they were essential for waterproofing wooden ships. And literally all of this wealth flowed straight through Charlestown, which was strategically sitting right at the junction of the Ashley and Cooper rivers.
Okay, time for our first pause check to make sure we understand what drove that early Chesapeake economy. Think back to those early English settlers who were initially obsessed with just finding gold. What highly profitable cash crop actually saved the Jamestown colony from its early struggles and starvation? If you guessed tobacco, you hit the nail on the head. Initially, they wanted gold, but settlers quickly figured out tobacco was the only real, surefire way to make money for the Virginia Company. And here is why this matters. Tobacco is incredibly demanding. It requires immense amounts of land, and because of that, it requires an enormous amount of continuous labor. After enduring the horrific, starving time, they realized that curing tobacco leaves and shipping them in large wooden barrels back to Europe was their real ticket to profit. All right, that brings us to Section 3, Populations and Labor Systems. Basically, who was actually doing all this work? Well, it turns out the motivations for coming over varied wildly depending on where you went. Down in the Chesapeake, you had thousands of young, unmarried, unemployed Englishmen crossing the ocean, just hoping to find some kind of opportunity in those tobacco fields. But look at the Carolinas, totally different story. You had an influx of already wealthy English planters migrating up from the Caribbean island of Barbados. Meanwhile, in the middle colonies, Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn and the Quakers, who were strictly seeking a religious haven, creating Penn's Woods to escape persecution back in England.
But as the demand for agricultural workers in the South completely skyrocketed, colonies shifted to a devastating legal system, chattel slavery. This was a system that legally defined individuals of African descent not as people, but as property. They were to be bought, sold, and enslaved for life. It was a calculated shift that replaced temporary servitude by reducing human beings to the absolute status of commodities. To understand how this worked legally, look at the severe distinctions colonial lawmakers created. On one side, you had indentured servants. They worked for a set period of time, were mostly white, and actually held certain legal tax protections. For instance, heavy taxes were used to discourage planters from forcing white female servants to work in the fields. But on the other side, enslaved laborers faced lifelong servitude. Lawmakers deliberately wrote it into law that this enslaved status was inherited directly from the mother. This meant they were locking entire generations into perpetual bondage.
To really grasp the reality of this, look at this quote from 1705 by Robert Beverly, a wealthy Jamestown planter. He writes that slaves are following the condition of the mother, and are called slaves because it is for life. It shows you exactly how the Southern legal code systematically separated people based on race, using a cold administrative approach to view human beings solely as property to fuel the plantation economy.
So, let's do our second pause check. We know these labor laws were incredibly harsh, but where did the blueprints for the strict slave codes adopted by the Carolina colonies originally come from?
The answer? The Caribbean island of Barbados. Remember those wealthy Barbadian sugar planters we talked about? When they migrated to the Carolinas, they brought their established slave codes right along with them. By the early 1700s, these imported laws became the literal foundation for how the Carolinas legally treated Africans as mere commodities. They were already used to this ruthless system of forced labor in the West Indies, so they just transplanted those exact same legal codes into the Southern colonies to run their new rice and indigo plantations.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Let's head into Section 4, Recap and Final Thoughts, looking at our complete regional model.
So if we pull all these threads together, here is your fully labeled regional model. You can clearly see how geography ultimately shaped the crops, which in turn drove the population demographics, and tragically, the rise of chattel slavery. While the middle colonies used their temperate climate to grow grain, using diverse family labor, the South's warm, rich soil demanded massive plantations, and those plantations required intensive labor, which led elites to build immense wealth entirely on the backs of enslaved African people.
I'm going to leave you with a transfer question to really think about. Considering these deep, foundational differences in economies and labor systems, how might the distinct identities of the Middle and Southern colonies create major fault lines leading up to the American Civil War? Think about it. These fractures were forming long before the United States was even a country. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.